I fouled my pants and don't know whether it was fright or the dysentery that was still with me. The planes returned. They were two rocket-firing RAF Typhoons, which specialized in ground attack. I recognized the sound as they got nearer. There was another whoosh and then another, followed by an ear-splitting explosion. The carriage shook so violently that I thought we were going to topple over. As always, in such a task, it was over in no time. With such attacks, it was over in no time, and all was suddenly peaceful again. So they have to go and repair this train. And then finally, we had reached a snug little village called Meisburg on the German side of the border with Belgium. And once again, we see some nicer treatment. Our first job was to be cleaned up, and we were taken in pairs into the shower. I was asked to remove all personal items from my pockets, and all clothing was to be cleaned and fumigated. Don't worry, you'll get everything back. An English medic told me, here, put this on. It was a sort of cotton smock, which tied in the back and was just long enough to cover to the knee. First in came a great big American with the same garb, with forearms like tree branches. He lifted me bodily with the ease of Samson himself. Mind you, I was down from 14 stone to just over 8 since last September. And to translate that into American English, he weighed 196 pounds in September, and now he weighs 112. On reaching the shower, his mate asked, "Can you stand on one leg, bud?" "Sure," I said. Samson had taken his smock off and proceeded to bathe me while Hercules steadied me. I was carried back to a most luxurious bed with white sheets. God knows where they scrounged the sheets, but trust the Yanks. There were approximately 40 wounded there, a mixture of English, French, and American, with 4 American and 2 English orderlies. One of the walking wounded acted as a cook, while the others doing menial tasks. They did not mind, though. So he's in this pretty, God, can I even say? Let's just say an improved situation. An improved situation is what he's in. That goes on a little bit. No, even he calls it the luxury. Things began to liven up outside. The rumbling in the distance grew nearer, and groups of bedraggled, weary-looking Germans plodded through the village. The wounded borne by horse and cart. Field guns were manhandled, the luxury of any motorized transport being afforded to senior officers only, who clearly wished to withdraw in as dignified a manner as possible, leaving Unterofficers to do all the donkey work along with the Schützen and suffer all the humiliation of being seen by their own countrymen. It was a pathetic sight, like a cutting from the First World War film archives. As the dawn approached, the throb of motorized transport and tanks was very near. So he's seeing the Germans kind of walking back. He's seeing the officers in the vehicles, the German officers in the vehicles, and the German troops walking or being carried if they were wounded. And he hears tank activity, right? Which is kind of an indication when you hear tank activity, but you see people withdrawing with horses and carriages. That's an indication that perhaps the tanks that we're hearing are good friendlies. As dawn approached, the throb of motorized transport and the tanks was very near. You could hear the squeak of the tank's wheels rubbing against the caterpillar track, thirsty for lubrication, edging and shunting into position for the impending advance in the village. That noise that a tank makes in the city is just is awesome. And it's also horrifying. Like these guys, when they were hearing the German tanks outside, when they're in that battle where they're about to be overrun, the horror, can't even imagine, of tanks coming. And now the joy, which I got to experience some of the joy in Ramadi of, hey, the tanks are coming. It's glorious. And God bless the tankers. And here these guys feeling the same way. The American orderlies were jubilant. They're here, Limey. The Yanks are here, exploded Hank. Anyone who could get up, walk, hop, or propel themselves in some way momentarily forgot their wounds and discomfort. They peered through the cracks in the doors, through the windows. I could not see anything from my window, only the Nazi flag of the local garrison, hanging listless, like the enemy itself. Bill, one of the English medics, came dashing in, not knowing which way to turn in his excitement. There's hundreds of them. There's hundreds of tanks out there. Bloody well, hundreds of them. Sherman tanks of General Patton's armored division had encircled the village in the early hours of that morning and were in a very advantageous position, as we were in the valley and they were on the high ground. Every gun would have its own selected target with orders to open fire if fired upon. Thankfully, the tanks played a waiting game with the non-existent enemy because unknown to the Americans, the birds had flown. An American scout car ventured cautiously toward the village. Unmolested, it reached the outskirts, scanning the buildings where white flags were protruding. No sign of the enemy. Still in view of the tanks on the hill, it became bolder and cruised gently into the village. Our makeshift hospital with a painted red cross on the roof must have been in view of the scout car now. All these goings-on were being shouted by one of the medics in the passageway for the benefit of all those like me who could not see for themselves. So he's getting a play-by-play. The scout car came to a stop, its occupants clutching their automatics at the ready. They must have spotted someone step carefully into view. That person was a medic with a Red Cross armband, Hank, the orderly from Ohio. He was about 100 yards from the scout car, and they stealthily approached each other, Hank not wishing to be mistaken for a German ruse, though in the scout car not wishing to fall for any trick. As they drew closer, the realization dawned that they were brothers. A wireless call was immediately sent to the tanks on the skyline, and in minutes the village was alive to their rumble as they thundered on through, leaving an acrid smell of oil and exhaust fumes. I was almost home. And I got to that point in the book and I was like, well, that's where you stop. And it's definitely a good place to stop, but let's take that as a stop. That incredible glory of seeing the Americans, seeing Patton's armored division roll in, and knowing that he was almost home. But there are some things to think about, and he covers them in the epilogue here. He says the casualties in the Arnhem area alone were 8,000 airborne killed, wounded, captured, or missing, including Poles, plus more than 400 RAF pilots and crew. There were 750 Dutch civilians and underground fighters killed, at least 2,500 Germans, and in the following winter of 1944 to 1945, some 200,000 Dutch died of starvation. So it's important to understand that these, you see this through one man's eyes, but that thousands, in fact hundreds of thousands, were affected by this particular battle. And again, that might be a good place to stop, but there's another note here. He talks about several years later, I visited the place of thinking, if you will, of that great man and founder of the parachute regiment, Winston Churchill. The war rooms, situated far below ground at the Treasury Chambers in Westminster. The existence of these warren of rooms was a well-kept secret during the war years. The tour was fascinating. Everything remained exactly as it had been back then. I sat in Churchill's chair. In front of me on the desk, printed in black on a card, the words of Queen Victoria. In this house, we never speak of defeat. In this house, we never speak of defeat. And he goes on, in the toilet, there was a red telephone, a direct line to President Roosevelt in Washington. In the visiting minister's room, I opened a book entitled World War II on the Sicily landings and saw a training shot of members of my 11th SAS battalion. To the fore in the lineup were Harry Bance, Corporal Hudson, Jimmy Metcalf, and myself. Down here beneath Westminster, surrounded, I am sure, by a dedicated team, Churchill did his job extremely well. I would like to think that I did my best alongside other leopards, lions, and tigers of the 1st Parachute Brigade. And again, I really didn't get into the fact that at one point their call signs, their code names had been the Leopards, Lions, and Tigers. That's what the different battalions were called. Could be a good place to stop, but I'm going to go a little bit further. This is actually in the preface of this book, and he says, when the war ended, because he survived, he was home. When the war ended, I found it a little difficult initially knuckling down to civilian life. The letter from the government saying, "You are now a civilian," seemed so sudden. I couldn't face the prospect of an office job, so I tried manufacturing, making handbags, before joining my brother-in-law John in his landscape gardening business, and then branching out on my own in the same line of work. Having an artificial leg didn't help, but I didn't let it hinder me. And the limb fitting center at Gillingham kindly reinforced my artificial knee for kneeling several times. I got a BSA motorbike and sidecar and had the gears modified to operate by hand instead of foot. I built my own house. You do the best you can. Again, I mean, hey, found it a little rough, but guess what? I'm going to go to work. I'm going to start a business. I'm going to build a house. I'm going to drive a motorbike around the country with a sidecar. You do the best you can. And I also wanted to say that he wasn't alone. He obviously needed that sidecar for someone. And I'm quite sure that was one of the dedications of the book is for Betty Francis, Reg's wife, who, as he puts it, helped me so much. And the last thing I'll say, and the last thing I'll read from this book, I should say, is the dedication. And he says, I dedicate this book to all my airborne friends who never came back, whose actions made it possible for me and other airborne friends to enjoy over 70 years of living. And that is, well, that's the parts I'm going to read from this book. But Reg Curtis died on January 29th, 2016, 94 years old. He was the last surviving member of the original 1st Parachute Battalion, the last of those initial 500 men that took that step forward and volunteered for parachute and commando training in 1940. And the book, which is called The Memory Endures, the book, it's actually not available on Amazon. It's not available in bookstores. I actually got it. I got it from somebody that sent it to me. And with no inscription in it. It says, he sent me a note. It says, "Dear John."